Welcome to this Programming for Cultural Heritage lecture. Today we're going to be looking at the introduction to Python. And before we get into talking about the various syntax and actually how to start programming in Python, we actually need to install the Python program on our computer. And so the Python application is just like the other applications we used in previous lectures on the command line, things like grep and less and tail, and etc. It's just a program that you run, you feed it some input, so a Python file to process, and it will do some results and return the results. And so to get started, we actually need to install it on our computers to get it working. And so there's a couple of areas that we're going to be talking about. The first is installing the interpreter, Python interpreter on our computers. For most of us, we'll also need to install an editor. And so an editor allows us to edit the Python files that we send into the Python program to execute. We're going to talk a little bit more some advanced options, possibly combining your editor and interpreter together so you don't need to kind of switch between windows too much. We're going to look at the Google Colab and some other Python notebook options. And so this is a different way of interacting with Python, a little bit more graphical. And then we're going to have some links to some more technical implementations if you wanted to go that route. So first we're going to go through each kind of operating system and type of installation and go through and get the install working. So the first one we're going to look at is a Macintosh. So if you have a Mac, we're going to do the basic installation, and we're going to do install an editor as well. And so what we need to do is head over to the python.org site. And the python.org site will give us a link to download the program, the Python program. So head over to python.org and it will look something like this. And you're just going to say, okay, download Python 2.85, or that's the version that is currently available right now when I'm recording this. But whatever version is available to you, you just click that green, yellow button, and it will download a file, a PKG file for if you're on Macintosh, and you just open that up. So let's try that. You're going to open up the package. You'll see, these standards. If you installed software before on a Mac, you'll see this is very boilerplate type thing. Continue, agree to the license, and then you click install, right? And so this will go through and it will install the Python program on your computer, and you'll say successfully installed, and you'll be done. And so what you're going to want to do is, to make sure it works, is that you're going to want to open up a new terminal window. And so you're going to go up there and run terminal, right? And once the terminal is open, let me make this a little clearer. Once the terminal is open, if you type the word Python, right, and hit tab a couple times, so the tab key, you'll see that it will try to autocomplete for you, right? We learned about the autocomplete feature of tab in the command line before. And so this tab key will show you the list of programs called Python on our computer that can be run at this point. And you'll notice there's a few versions, right? So there's a Python, Python 2.7, Python 3.8, etc., right? So the reason this is because if you're using a Mac, it comes with Python 2.7 installed already. And so 2.7 is a fairly old version of Python that's kind of hung around for compatibility reasons in this operating system. But we're not going to be using Python 2.7. We want to use Python 3. Whatever, the new version, 3.8 in our case. And so for us, we're going to make sure that whenever we run a Python file, we always use Python 3. And so if we're going to use Python 3, we just say Python 3 and then the name of the file, right? So let's give an example of this. I'm going to open up this editor that I have already installed, and we'll talk about editors a little bit more. But I have Sublime here open, and this is just a kind of a straightforward text editor. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write, print hello, right? And so this is just, a one-line Python program. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm just going to save it on my desktop for now. I'm going to call it hello.py. And so as soon as I save it as a py file, so all Python files have .py, as soon as I save it as a py file, you'll see it starts highlighting the syntax as a Python file. So this is what's really nice about having an editor, because it does things like syntax highlighting. All right, so now I know this file is on my desktop. So if I went over and I looked on my desktop, I can see there it is. There's hello.py. And if I go back to my terminal application, I can try to run it. So if we're in our terminal and I know I'm in my user directory, right? I can change directory to my desktop. That's where this Python file is. And if I type Python 3, right, the 3 is important because we're using the version 3, and then the name of the file, hello.py, and run it, it does a little command, right? It executed our one kind of line command, and it returned the results to the screen. And so that's the typical way that we'll be using Python in the kind of, if you want to use Python in this kind of very straightforward intermediate ways, by basically going to your editor, editing the file, saving it, coming back over. You can press the up key in your terminal and it will repeat the last command, run it again. So examples, say I went over and made a change, I added another word to the command, to the Python file, run it again, and the change will show up, right? So this is kind of like back and forth way that you can very simply start working with Python. So one other thing to note though is if you did accidentally just type Python 3 and hit enter, you'll be kicked into this kind of screen. And so Python has two modes of operating on the command line like this. It has the interactive mode, this IRB mode, where you basically can type Python commands, like a print is a Python command, and it will evaluate that command and do it immediately, right? And so this is nice if you want to do some kind of like testing out some different things, but it's not great as a kind of development environment because it's real time kind of, there's no syntax highlighting, there's no editor. It's very kind of finicky about the syntax, spacing and stuff like that. So this is not the best thing. So usually you would not want to be in this mode. And so if you are in this mode, you can just press Control D, so the control button, Control on Mac, and the letter D, the key D, and it will break back to the command line. So if you accidentally, sometimes, I do this often, you try to type Python 3 and then you're going to type the name of the file, but you hit enter first and you're in this kind of interactive mode. Probably don't want to be here, just hit Control D and you'll go back to it, and then you can, run the script that you wanted to, right? All right, so that's the way you'd install Python on a Mac. The only other thing that you'd want to have, make sure you install, is an editor, right? So I use Sublime Text right there, just as an example. But there are a couple other open source editors. Sublime Text is not free, it's like a shareware editor. So these two other ones, Code.Visual Studio, Visual Studios by Microsoft, and Atom.io, these are two other options that you can use that are free editors. So I'd recommend, try checking out the code editor or Visual Studio Code and seeing how you like it. And then also, you can also check out the Atom editor and install it and see how you like that one. But once you have the Python program installed and you have an editor installed, you're all set to start developing with Python. Okay, so the next thing we're going to try is, if you're on a Windows machine, we're going to try to install Python, a basic install in Python from the python.org site on Windows, and see what installs for you, and some kind of how you could get started just using that basic install for Windows. So if you're on Windows, you head over to python.org, go to downloads the latest version, and you save that file, or you can run it, right? We'll run that file. All right, and so it's going to launch an installer, and make sure you say, okay, install launcher for all users, right? But also make sure you check this add Python 3.8 to path. And so that will save you some headaches later when you're trying to do things like install libraries and stuff like that. Just make sure that this last checkbox is installed when you install it. Okay, so we're going to install now. Okay, so it says installation was successful. And so now if we go to our start menu, we should see some new programs here. we should see Python IDLE installed here and some manuals and other stuff like that. So if we launch this IDLE, um, Python on Windows comes built in with kind of like its own editor. And so what you can do is go to File, New File, and it will open up this Python kind of net editor that comes built in. And so using this is kind of like a basic way you could get started with Python on Windows, is just using this built-in editor that comes with install. And so, we can do print, our same thing, hello. And so to run this application or to run the script, we're going to save it to, let's save it on the desktop again, hello.py. And so to run it in Windows, you just come up here and say run and run module. And so this will run the program you've just been working on in this editor window, and it will display the results here in this new window. And so that's one way you can get started very simply in Python with Windows, is just you come in here, make changes again, and simply save it, and run it again. And it'll just go back and forth and make changes and edit and run it again. So that's the bare minimum you can do to get it working on Windows. And the next thing we're going to look at is some more kind of integrations with some editors. Okay, so we saw how to do these basic installs, right? But the next thing we want to see is if we can try to install Python with an editor combined. And so this will kind of give it a little bit more seamless interaction. Right now it's fine. I often just use Sublime and I tab back and forth between my editor, my Sublime editor and the command line and run the script again, etc. But let's take a look if we can try to get Visual Studio Code integrated with Python and see if you prefer that kind of environment, development environment better. So I haven't done this yet on this computer, so I'm going to download it on Mac. I'm on Mac. So it's going to download the zip file, all right? And so I'm going to unzip it, and it's going to run Visual Studio Code. All right, so let's try to get started. So let's try to just start editing a new file. And let's, we'll just do another print command. We're going to save it out to the desktop again. On our desktop, and we'll say test.py. All right, so let's save that. And so as soon as I said it was a py file, you notice down here in the corner, it will say something about the Python extension is recommended for this file type. Okay, so you say install, and you'll see up here it's doing some work. Okay, and it's saying, okay, so it's installing. And it will also say some things like the Python linter is not installed. The linter is just a little program to check your syntax of your code. So you can try installing that too. Okay. All right, so if I'm on a Python program, I should be able to execute it. Right, so all I did is I went up to the run command and I said run without debugging, or you can try it running with debugging. Let's try that one. No. So if you just go up to run and say run without debugging, it will actually execute the script in line here down at the bottom of the screen. And so that's nice in that it's using the latest version of Python, and you don't have to kind of tab back and forth between the different uh, windows, right? You can just run. You can come up here and change your script again, and just simply run it again, right? And you'll see the results immediately. So this is kind of like a little bit more advanced feature if you want to not have to go back and forth between the editor and the terminal and rerunning it over and over again. You can just use Visual Studio Code and get that installed and have it working um, that way. Otherwise, you can keep using, if you want to use Visual Studio Code just as the way you were using before, you don't necessarily have to use the built-in kind of terminal. You can just close this window and just save the file like it's a regular text editor, and it does the syntax highlighting as well. So another option, if you find this kind of approach a little bit more suitable to your style of development. So we just looked at installing it for Macintosh and Visual Studio Code. So the process should be very similar for doing this on Windows as well. So if you're on a Windows machine, you want to do that sort of incorporated editor and interpreter in the same window, you can just do that using the same idea as installing Visual Studio Code, but on your Windows machine, right? So I'm on the Visual Studio Code site here. I'm going to say download for Windows. I'm going to run it. Go through the installation process here. I'll say create a desktop icon for it. Install. All right, so let's launch it. And we're going to make a new file again. And save it. It's called test.py. Save. And the same idea will come up and say, oh, are you trying to install, this is a Python file. Do you want to install all the Python modules for Visual Studio Code to help you? So we say yes. Okay, and it says no Python interpreter is selected. You need to select a Python interpreter to enable features such as IntelliSense linting and debugging. So let's try to select a Python interpreter. And if we had installed it previously, it should come up with kind of a suggestion here. So let's try that one. And it says, do you want to install a linter? We'll say sure. All right, so now if we go back to our file that we were editing, and we should be able to go up to the run and run without debug. And we should hopefully see the output of the script, right? And so there it is. It outputs the print command that we're testing. And of course, you'll do some more development and come back in and run it again and see the results. So a little bit very similar approach to installing Visual Studio Code on Windows. You do have to do that last step where you have to kind of point it to where the Python executable is. So that's one little step, but we should walk through that. And then you'll have the same environment set up where you can do your editing and your kind of debugging and running in the same window, and you're ready to go. And the final kind of way you can run Python scripts that we're going to talk about in this lecture is our Python notebooks. And so Python notebooks are a fairly modern kind of approach to writing Python scripts. And basically they are, you don't interact with the shell or the network or the command line. You basically have a wrapper around the Python interpreter, and it provides a much more graphical interface to this interactive method of writing Python scripts. And so if you wanted to try this out, I would say that one way to get started very simply is trying this hosted version of basically a Python notebook run by Google currently in 2020. So what you can do is try out the Google version of the notebook, and then if you like it, but you want to run it yourself on your own computer, you can install your own version of it. And so just to kind of give you an example of what so if you search for Google Colab, um, you should come up on this results, and you can just go into colab.research.google.org or .com, and basically this will, you have to have a Google account most likely and be signed in, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll see this page, you can say new notebook, and basically this is what a Google or a Python notebook looks like, right? And so instead of writing the script kind of in a editor and then doing each command kind of all at once and it executes an entire series of commands, you can kind of do things one at a time, right? So you can write Python statements in here, and you can evaluate this one at a time, and it will kind of execute that Python statement in the background and show you the results. And so you can go through and say you define a variable. You'll say my hello string is equal to this hello, right? And I evaluate that. Things kind of are consistent across the different kind of inputs, right? So my hello string is still defined here, and I can play that, and it will tell me the value of it, right? So this is kind of, it might be a little bit confusing. So just keep about, it's good to start off with this very basic kind of like doing it in an editor and then running the script and going back. But if you find yourself kind of thinking about, oh, this might be nice to be able to go back and evaluate different parts of the script at different times and take advantage of these notebook features, think about using this. And so I would say if you wanted to try using this Python notebook, try out the Google Colab version of it first. And then if you're like, this is great, I really enjoy using the notebook version of it, you can try to get it installed yourself. And so you could head over to jupyter.org/install, and you can figure out how to get something very similar to that Google Colab running on your own machine. And so the only thing would be about having, if you're going to be working with like large files, like large CSV files or large data files, if you use the hosted version of it, the Colab, the files have to be up there in the Google Cloud. Whereas if you're running your own version of it, it's on your computer like everything else. So that's the only thing to think about. But give it a try if you enjoy the kind of idea of having in this more of a web-based Python experience. This might be a better option for you. And so the last thing we are going to talk about is these more advanced installation methods for Python. And so this is totally unnecessary to our basic introduction to Python and getting things up and running and starting developing Python. But it's just good to keep in mind in the future if you hear people talking about this or these terminologies thrown around, just to make you aware of these tools. And so say, for example, you were in an environment where you wanted to kind of make sure that your Python script runs specifically tied to a specific version and a specific version of libraries and modules installed, etc. One tool to do that is virtual env. And so what this tool does is basically it creates an entire virtual environment for a Python script to execute. And so what's nice about that is that it can kind of track dependencies and make sure everything is lined up perfectly and is reproducible, in 5 years, for example. And knows exactly how the script should run. Because you can imagine if you wrote a script and you used one version of a library and then 5 years later there's a new version of it and they're not compatible. So this virtual env makes sure that it's using the right version of Python and the right versions of the libraries that you're using. Similarly, PyEnv is just a way to have multiple versions of Python installed at the same time on your computer. So for example, if you're on the Mac, it automatically has 2.7, and we just installed 3.8 in this lecture. But you can imagine, if you wanted to have many different versions of Python installed for different various reasons. You'd want to be able to have an easy way to switch between them, right, on the command line. And so PyEnv does that. It lets you install more has more control over which version of Python is actually the kind of predominant version of Python on your system, and easily switch between them. So these tools are not necessary to install, so don't feel like you should even need to investigate these. It's just to keep in mind that there are these more advanced tools to help kind of corral your Python installation. And so with that, you should have a editor installed and the Python interpreter installed, and should be set to go with starting to develop your Python scripts.